Commissioner Moedas, a warm welcome to you. From the beginning of your mandate, you have tried to position innovation really as a broad and as a societal phenomenon. I think that that's been very much observed by all of us. So not innovation, not as an event or a linear process, but really as a process of perhaps reframing problems to find novel solutions. So the first question I want to ask you is, how would you define inclusive innovation, and why is it so important that innovation be really very open and accessible to all? What's happening here?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be here because, I mean, I'm a big fan of Ann Mettler as a person and everything that she has done over the years. So it's really great to be here for a discussion with her, because a lot of the inspiration that I get comes from her. But in terms of the question of inclusive innovation and open innovation, I was very lucky because I started in the year 2000. I had as a professor Henry Chesbrough, which was the man who basically is the father of open innovation, at a time where people really didn't understand what open innovation was about. And a lot of people at the time, if you remember, people just thought that we were in this Schumpeterian kind of way, that you would just create something, push it from the producer to the user. And Henry Chesbrough was the first man to say that, look, this is not a linear process. And that was really beginning of 2000, 2001 until 2003 when he wrote his book. And I think that today everybody understands that without openness, and I would add to that, without diversity and conflict, you don't have innovation. And I think that that is something that we all understand, but we preach, but we don't do, because we don't want to get out of our comfort zone. And it's very difficult. I mean, innovation is a painful process. It hurts. And so people really resist to it. And it's much easier for all of us to speak about it, but then we don't do it. And that's the point, one of the points that I really want to make today, that the process of innovation is a painful one, is a difficult one, and so you have to do more than talk about it. You have to do it in your day-to-day actions, and that's where things sometimes don't happen. But the point on inclusive innovation that Anne was making, I think that's one that if Anne allows me, to get more to another angle to inclusiveness, because I think what's going on today, where all of us acknowledge that globalization has decreased poverty, and that's a fantastic thing, but sometimes we forgot about that globalization really decreased poverty overall, but it increased inequality. And I think that innovation has a very important role to play on how to actually get a better balance in really doing a diffusion of that innovation that is more equal. And so one of the solutions for this problem of the inequality of the distribution is exactly on innovation. And that was one point that I think that we probably are not tackling it in the right way. And as an engineer, wannabe economist, I really look at these problems always on a demand side and a supply side problem. And when you look at the point that the productivity in the ICT sector has been growing overall and over the years, you think, but why is it stagnated in other sectors? And so you have a sector that is ICT, where you have 10% of Western economies, probably 10% ICT, with productivity going up. And then all the other sectors have been stagnated. So there's something in this process of diffusion of the innovation that is not working. And I think why? Because there's constraints on the demand side and on the supply side. On the demand side, the good news is that we are at a tipping point, because we all know that we're going from an internet of things to an internet of everything. And so it means that on the demand side, the problem is going to get solved by itself, by the fact that this is trickling down to the health sector, to the energy sector, and to other sectors. But the problem is on the supply side. On the supply side, I think we have constraints of capital and constraints of skills. And those two constraints are the ones that we've been not able to solve yet. I don't know if you've seen in the news, and then I'll just send it to you, that the Finnish education system is changing totally in secondary education. And I think that it's just amazing. Basically, there will be no more disciplines, as you understand it, normally with mathematics and geography and you name it. It will be around subjects and will be around topics or events. So the Finnish who are really advanced in terms of education, they are doing a total turnaround in terms of their education. They're putting everything the other way around. So they will look at the World War II and look at it in terms of mathematics, geography, anthropology, sociology. And I think this is something that we try to do, but we don't do enough, and I think the Finnish example is a good one. So we can talk a little bit more about these constraints, but I think that inclusiveness will depend on us being able to do this diffusion of the innovation from the top to the bottom, and this is not happening in our society. Anne.
Very good. Thank you so much. I think these were very a good observation, particularly on the issue of perhaps reframing problems if you want to find novel solutions, and underpinning some of the difficulty of doing that. But I was wondering, I mean, this is a session on game changers for inclusive innovation. Commissioner, you travel around Europe to see sort of innovation highlights. We actually saw each other last week in Lisbon at the Web Summit. So what do you think could be some of these game changers for inclusive innovation? And are we already seeing them in parts of Europe?
We are already seeing that because this comes from this movement from open innovation to user innovation. And what you see is that we went from the concept of being open, so not a linear process, to a process where the user is actually giving all the information to the producer. And that happens in every sector. So I'm going to just be very clear in an example that I really like and that I've met personally. So it's much easier to tell a story that you really know about what I think this inclusiveness is doing. Because for me, is inclusiveness not just in the area of frugal innovation or in the area of social innovation, but also inclusiveness in the fact that the users are the one in command. For me, the concept of inclusive innovation is much broader. And 1 year ago, I gave a prize in terms of really a fantastic thing that happens every 2 years in Portugal in the university on user innovation in the health sector. And it's called patient innovation. And that for me is the really inclusive innovation, is when the doctor is not anymore the one innovating. And it's not really just about innovation in the medical sector. And so this man, who is a boiling engineer in the UK, had really a very, very, very tough disease called the Marfan syndrome. And the Marfan syndrome is when your aorta in your heart is not strong enough to get the blood through, and so it can just blow and you die. And the doctor told him, look, you have 6 months, and so after 6 months, there's nothing I can do, you're gonna probably die, right? And he went home as a boiling engineer, and he said, look, I have to solve this myself, I'm a boiling engineer. And so he got a couple of friends together with a couple of doctors, and he started designing a valve to protect his aorta. And so he did it, and now there's more than 200 people that have been saved by a boiling engineer that became an innovator in the health sector. And that's really what I call the inclusiveness of other disciplines. And for me, I know that probably some of you thought about this session more about inclusive in terms of frugal and social innovation, which we also can talk about. But for me, today, this inclusiveness is about the user, about the citizen. And so that's more the angle that I have in terms of inclusive innovation. But of course, I think the biggest challenge that we have overall in terms of all these types of innovation is that most of us don't relate to innovation as being something that is more than an invention. And so that's a preaching that Anne and I have been making around Europe, but it's still very difficult. But the game changers are the users, are the citizens. And you see it also in frugal innovation, in social innovation. Is not the government, is not the producer, is the user. This is the one that is giving it back. And so one of the very interesting books that is going to come out very soon from an MIT professor that was really the father of user innovation, Eric van Hippel, is called Free Innovation. And so the concept is that the user normally gives it for free. And then the producer gets it and makes value out of it. But the user and the community of users that you're going to see now with the social media are people that are so passionate about the subject that they just give it for free. And so we are now on this brink of this new concept that we would call in the future, if I don't know, depending on how successful is this book, the free innovation, which is also, if you're interested about these subjects, I think it's a good book.
It's actually very exciting, because if innovation can be for free, it means also it's accessible to all. Now, we're discussing here today Global Trends 2030. So a lot of the discussions are around sort of weak signals that we are seeing today that may become significant global trends in the future. Is there anything that you see on the horizon that you think we should pay greater attention to, and we're currently not doing it?
I think that what I'm seeing in these 2 years that I've been talking to innovators and is that the trend will always be, and is already, at the intersections of all these disciplines with the digital world. And so what you see is that, as a little bit as Steve Case always put it, is that the entrepreneur of the future, the innovator of the future, he will have to deal much more with governments than he did before. So on the first wave of the internet, the second wave of the internet, the first wave was about building the internet, of course, and the second one was about entrepreneurs that couldn't care less about governments and regulation because they were just doing their business. And on this third wave, what I'm seeing is that the interaction in between the governments and the entrepreneur will be key for the success of the entrepreneur, because we are getting in sectors that are heavily regulated: water, energy, food, health, you name it. And so these are the trends that I'm seeing, is that these entrepreneurs are much more in the driving seat of looking how regulation works, how they can shape the future. So that's one of the trends that I see in everyone that I've been talking to. Then the other trend that I think it's crucial is the trend of really being in the intersection of disciplines. And you see that in fundamental science. I'm looking at Professor Bourguignon from the ERC, and he has been really a great leader in the way that intersections matter. And so in the case of fundamental science, you see that already in all the grants of the ERC, where people come from different areas and they actually solve problems in other areas. The other day I met this ERC grantee who is a Brazilian guy that started as an electrical engineer and then he went into nanotechnology, and so he got a grant from the ERC to solve the problem of energy efficiency. Why? Because he's applying nanotechnology to an electrical concept that is the base of his studies. And so I think that we will see more and more these borders being very, 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 I mean, so low that basically you'll get into the different sectors. And so I think that the whole education point that we were making, it's probably one of the most important, because I'm very worried when I see that we all preach that we should be different, that we should look at things not in between disciplines but at the intersections. And then you go and you look at your kids and they come home and they are doing and being taught the way we were taught 20 years ago. And that, I think, there's something that we really have to think, because we talk here, and then what do we do about it? What are the education systems changing? Nothing, and that is really worrying for me. But I see just on the energy sector, on the water sector, on the food sector, and really on the health sector, I see the major trends of this user and intersection innovation, and that's the answer.
These are fascinating insights you share. I mean, the innovation occurs at the intersection of different disciplines, particularly when diffused with digital technologies. I mean, that's really a step change from how innovation used to be done. I was reminded, I spent a week at Stanford University this past summer, and there was a medical team that wanted to essentially use 3D printing to print organs. And they were down the street from HP. And so they started a collaboration with HP on printing organs. And the reason I'm telling this story is because it's not just doing it, it's a mindset. It is a skill to essentially imagine the unimaginable. Can you say something about the skill set, but also the governance? Because the reality is government is still organized in silos, and it can be very difficult to bring these things together at the intersection of different disciplines. So I think a lot of it is around institutional setup. A lot of it is around a skill set that is open to things that are so radically different that some people might laugh at you, you know? So how do you bring this about?
I think I've worked in my former capacity in the Portuguese government, and I think one of the most difficult things is how you make people work together in different departments of government. And normally politicians that say, no, people don't work together because they don't want to work together. I mean, they're just not friends. And I think that is totally wrong, is because you don't give them the incentives. And it's all about cross incentives in cross departments. So how can I make someone that is one department of health to work with someone in the department of energy? It's not just to tell them to be friends, because that's not going to happen. You have to create the incentives for that to happen. And I think that in institutions, what you have today is that you create the incentives at the top, and then you don't create the incentives at the bottom. And so there's a mismatch. So people talk about it, we come to these conferences, but then you don't do it. And so how do you do it? Through the evaluation processes, a 360-degree evaluation process where you can put people really being evaluated by the collaboration that they do. Have you done a project this year with your colleagues from another department? If yes, you get more points. If yes, you get a better evaluation of your work. And so I think this a lot comes from how you get people the right incentives, because people do it if they have the right incentives. So many people come to me and say, oh, but you know, all these Europeans, they are not as prone to risk as Americans. And I said, no, not at all. I think that Europeans are much, 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 much tougher, and they actually do it even with a lot of risks, and they are entrepreneurs. But it's not a question, it's a question of the incentives. And so we actually are, I said it several times, I think that European entrepreneur is better in the sense that he has so many bottlenecks and difficulties, and even though he makes it. And so I think that it's a question really of incentives. And a lot of the Europeans that I know go to other parts of the world and they take all the risks. So I never believe in answers that are cultural differences. I don't believe in cultural differences. We behave through incentives. And it's not because you're Portuguese or Spanish or Finnish or Danish. You work the same if you have the right incentives. And so people work through the incentives. So the institutions have to put these incentives in all layers if they want that to happen. And so far my experience is that normally you do it in some parts, but then you don't do it in the whole organization, and that's what we have to.
So in essence, what you're saying is we also need an element of workplace innovation, perhaps, to change the incentive structure. And the reality is that's not very much on the horizon of many people, sadly. But I'm glad you brought it up here today. We have perhaps a time for 2 questions or so before you have to go to the college. Do I see anyone who wants to ask the commissioner a question? So we have the gentleman over there. Please stand up and introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm a bit intimidated asking the first question because I'm not from Europe, I'm from Canada. So thank you very much for opening this conference to Europe's partners. It's wonderful to be here. I'm at the mission of Canada to the EU, but I used to work on policy planning back in Ottawa, and we have the new director of our policy planning unit here as well today. But I love what you said about open innovation. We did an experiment in the Foreign Ministry in Canada a few years ago to see whether open innovation could be applied in the public sector. It was an utter failure. It did not work. I mean, we tried to make people break silos, share information, experiment, take risks, and the culture in the public service, not just in Canada but everywhere, works very strongly against all of that. So I wondered if you had any thoughts as to how we can move an open innovation culture to the public sector efficiently. Our problem with incentives was not at the top nor at the bottom. The young people understand it. Senior managers who are exposed to new thinking understand it. The problem was the middle. The most difficult people were the middle managers, the most territorial, traditional people were in the middle. So we were trying to build incentives to address that issue, but that it didn't work very well. So any thoughts you have on the future of open innovation in the public sector and how we make a transition would be extremely appreciated. And if anybody would like to discuss our project, I'm happy to talk about it. As I said, you need to fail sometimes to learn lessons, but that's not a lesson that is easily absorbed in the public sector. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Maybe we take one more, or you want to
Yeah,
immediately?
no, just
this is
I
a
just
very
want to
meaty
react
question.
because
Maybe
I think is such an important question. I think that there's a professor of mine at the Harvard Business School used to say that there's no innovation without diversity and conflict. And I think that one of the things that is more difficult is to create an environment around you where you actually have conflict that is not chaotic, but is positive, and that people don't take it personal. And so I think that for that, the only way is that you create a culture of managers that allow people around them to fail, and actually, when they fail, they thank them for the failure, not the other way around. They just say, look, you failed, it's because you're working, it's because you're trying. So do it, keep doing it. And I think that historically, that doesn't happen. So that layer in the middle that you're talking is the layer that is really afraid. They are really afraid of failure. They are afraid of conflict, because they think if you have a conflict, someone has to win and someone has to lose, and if you lose, you're the bad guy and the other one is the very good one, and so he's going to get the promotion and not you. And so it's really a mindset and a cultural change that has to come from the managers. So you have really to do a lot of training courses at the level of the managers, so they allow that. And that is something that, if it doesn't come from the bottom, doesn't happen, but has to get a lot of training, because people naturally, they don't do it. There's really in the management culture, and I've seen it in different public administrations, a way that you feel that you cannot fail. And so your worry is not about the result, it's about showing that you didn't fail, that someone else did. And so you basically spend your time on a game of who failed, but not what do you do about it. And that is something that takes a long time. And it's not typical of one country, it's typical of a group of incentives that you have sometimes in the public sector.
Very good. We'll take another. It's my job to get you to the college on time, but I saw Enrico had his hand up. and Nick Gowing as well. So perhaps, but please introduce yourself, Enrico, and ask a very brief question, please.
Enrico Giovannini, professor at the University of Rome and a visiting fellow at the EPSC, and I have to wrap up this day, so I'm very curious about one particular point. During your term, you have a very important responsibility, the design of the new cycle for the investment in research and innovation for Europe. What kind of ideas or innovative ideas are you planning to inject in this new plan? And by the way, I learned recently that the European program is open to all countries in the world, which is not really very common around the world. And how do you see this political role of Europe vis-à-vis other countries changing the game in a world full of shocks, as Anne said?
Very good. Thank you so much. We'll take the next one immediately, just so I'm conscientious of time. Nick.
Thank you. Good morning. Can I just pick up a couple of the comments you made? I'm Nick Gowing, and I'm currently a visiting professor at King's College, but I'm also co-author of Thinking the Unthinkable, and Anne, you've already used that phrase in your opening remarks, and we're going to be talking about it at 4:30. But can I just pick up a couple of things that the Commissioner has said? When you said most of us do not relate to innovation as more than an invention, I would suggest that underpinning this whole day is something broader than that. It's most of us do not relate to new realities as more than a brief disruption. And what we're talking about here is a very profound change, which we're going to be talking about through it. And your last remark is particularly important about management culture, which is something which has come out in our research, that no one wants to accept responsibility. And I would like to just say that at this point, because I think it underpins much of what you've brought us here to discuss, that this is about a fundamental switch in attitudes. It's about human capacity to understand the nature of change.
Thank you very much.
Excellent.
You know, even if I like to fail, I don't want to get fired by getting late to the college. But no, just, I mean, a couple of comments, and I think that you made very good comments. You know, I've been reading this book about really late life of when Stefan Zweig, before the war in the 1930s, was in Ostend with Roth. And they were talking about what was going on at the time. And I think that the idea of having Europe as a place of open innovation, open science, and openness to the world, I think is more than just a kind of European Commissioner for Science and Innovation statement. I think is more important than ever that we have that as the statement for the future. And so I see the next program that, by the way, I will have a great help of Pascal Lamy that will be heading a chair group that I have to look into the future in three ways: openness, excellence, and impact. And how can you have that in terms of science innovation? But openness for me is really the pillar. Without openness, there's nothing we can do. There's no innovation without openness. And if we can be the beacon of that openness in the world, I think I'll be proud at the end of all these. So absolutely, and thank you also for your comments and statements that I fully agree, and I hope that during the day you'll discuss more about all these, and thank you so much for the time. I'm so sorry that I cannot stay more, but I promise that next year I will overcompensate you by staying the whole day.
Very good. And Commissioner Moedas, just to say, I don't think we could have started the day in a better way, and I want to warmly thank you on behalf of our participants. And I wonder if this openness will soon become a very distinctive feature of Europe in the world, and something that we will all work towards. A warm thank you.